Hey folks, welcome. In this section of the course, we're going to talk about BlueGreen deployments. And this is a topic that is certainly featured significantly DevOps Professional Certification exam. So it's important to have a good understanding of BlueGreen deployments and to be thinking about the use cases and patterns in which you would utilize these different types of BlueGreen deployments. So that raises a question, what is a BlueGreen deployment? Probably no, but we'll cover it anyway. A BlueGreen deployment is a technique for releasing applications by shifting traffic between two identical environments running different versions of the application. Now, the advantage of this is there's some risk mitigation here. BlueGreen deployments are great if you want to avoid downtime, and they're certainly very convenient if you need to roll back. So the BlueGreen deployment is going to provide near zero downtime, release and rollback capabilities. And the concept behind all of this is that you're shifting traffic between two identical environments. They're just running different versions of your application. So the blue environment represents the current application version serving production traffic. In parallel, the green environment is staged running a different version of your application. So after the green environment is ready and tested, your production traffic can be shifted from the blue environment to the green environment. This can be done all at once, or it can be done using weighted routing. And with AWS, we're talking about Route 53. In the DevOps doctrine, let's click on BlueGreen deployments. Now, we are going to talk about several different patterns that we can use for BlueGreen deployments. This will serve you well if you get a scenario example on the DevOps Pro Certification exam. So, one way you can do BlueGreen deployments is to update DNS routing. So you can just point your DNS from the blue environment to the green environment. Another thing you can do if you have an auto-scaling group behind an elastic load balancer is you can just swap basically from a blue auto-scaling group to a green auto-scaling group. Another pattern is to switch your launch configuration. So there are several different ways you can go about BlueGreen deployment, and we'll cover some of the options here. Now, it's good to think in patterns. In other words, we don't have to implement these exactly as they will be depicted in the lesson, but you can apply these patterns to certain scenarios. For example, with the DNS routing, if you have DNS or an IP address, this is a route you can go. Now, we'll also talk about Docker BlueGreen deployments. Obviously, this would entail having Docker as part of your solution. Now, one other thing we're going to talk about in this section is A/B testing. Now, it's not exactly BlueGreen deployments, but it's similar enough that it's often lumped together with BlueGreen deployments. In fact, I've often heard it referred to as A/B deployments. I think that's just mixing the two terms together, A/B testing and BlueGreen deployments. But essentially with A/B testing, you have two environments. You're testing an application, which usually just have slight differences, or it could be major differences, but you're testing the reaction of your customer base to these differences and determining a winner based on your customer feedback. Now, the thing with BlueGreen deployments, which makes it so attractive in an AWS cloud environment, is that you need to duplicate your environment. And in a traditional on-premises sense, you're talking about duplicating your hardware. Now, of course, in a cloud environment, there's hardware somewhere being duplicated with the ability to essentially rent that hardware rather than buy it. BlueGreen deployments can become more practical. Now, BlueGreen deployments also fit nicely with continuous integration and continuous deployment workflows. You just have to consider less dependencies in that situation. Your new green environment gets launched onto an entirely new set of resources. And of course, once your deployment succeeds, you can decommission the blue environment and stop paying for the resources it was using. So there are a lot of advantages to BlueGreen deployments. Now, one of the drawbacks, of course, is the fact that you're going to be duplicating your resources, but with proper management of that, it doesn't have to be a long-term expense. Now, on our diagram, we're showing BlueGreen deployments with Route 53, and that's probably, if you have any notion of BlueGreen deployments, this is probably a resource that you're thinking about with BlueGreen deployments. But other services used for BlueGreen deployments include elastic load balancers, and certainly with application load balancers, you're routing traffic to specific applications, and that lends itself well to BlueGreen deployments. But again, we can work at the auto-scaling group, which is behind the elastic load balancer. So you can use your auto-scaling group with the load balancer to facilitate BlueGreen deployments. You can also work with different auto-scaling launch configurations to work with BlueGreen deployments. And of course, in upcoming lessons, we'll cover these in depth. Now, other services that can be used include Elastic Beanstalk and OpsWorks, and we've kind of done this already. Let's go into Elastic Beanstalk. So we have an environment, and we have the option to clone that environment. But then what we can do is, when we are ready to update the cloned environment, we perform our update on the cloned environment, and we can switch our DNS settings to point to our cloned environment. One simple way to do that is to swap environment URLs. But there will be a learning activity on doing just that at the end of this section. Let's go over to OpsWorks. So we have an OpsWorks stack, and note we have the option to clone our stack. So again, with OpsWorks, we could quickly set up a BlueGreen environment. Now, additionally, as you would probably expect by now, CloudFormation is a very versatile tool, and we could set all of this up in CloudFormation templates. So any of these patterns would work in a CloudFormation template. We can switch our DNS, we can switch our elastic load balancing, auto-scaling groups, and of course with CloudFormation, we can work with other services. We can use CloudFormation to configure our blue and green environments with Elastic Beanstalk. And again, it would just be a matter of working with Route 53 for that DNS changeover. So these are the main patterns for performing BlueGreen deployments. And again, let's keep in mind that they are patterns. So your solution doesn't have to match the layout of these patterns exactly. I'll go back to the example for Route 53. As long as you have a DNS or an IP address to point to, you can do this Route 53 switchover from blue to green. So in the upcoming lessons, we will dive deeper into these BlueGreen patterns. So go ahead and mark this lesson complete, and let's move on to the next.